Hello and welcome back, and thank you for joining me. Last time I introduced the idea of Jesus as the Logos and how he reconciles all things in heaven and on earth, including our world views, to himself. And therefore, for those that express some form of allegiance towards Christ, we should be doing likewise. I know that can sound very high-minded because this can call us into areas which we are unfamiliar or feel uncomfortable with. So I'd like to offer a short story from my own life that hopefully reflects on how naturally this idea of reconciliation can be. Because in this story, there is no wisdom on my part. The wisdom comes from elsewhere. So very many years ago, when I still had some hair, I was working and living in the Middle East with my family. And we had a Muslim friend. And we invited him and a friend of his to our house one evening. And we had a wonderful time. We were friends. We built the friendship up first. There was no agenda. There was no agenda for us to argue why Christianity was right and perhaps he was wrong, or vice versa. It was just a natural dialogue between friends. And unlike how I was brought up in the UK, where you're not supposed to talk about politics or religion, he definitely wanted to talk about politics and religion, and his friend was equally interested. And we had this wonderful open dialogue of just listening and responding to questions and listening to the response. And by the end of the evening, I think our friendship had grown. In fact, I know our friendship had grown because we had shared something that was very intimate to us. And this man said something very keen, very sharp, getting to the nub. He said, Phil, just like not all people who say they are Christians are Christian, not all Muslims are Muslim. And that has stayed with me for many, many years. Not only the conversation that evening we had, but that statement. Anyway, our friendship continued, and he was a friend of the family. And then some time passed, and without going into all kinds of detail, there was a fatal accident on the construction site I was working. And I was offered up as a scapegoat for this accident. The people I was sort of expecting to come to my cause were pretty much silent. I'd been arrested and I'd lost my passport, and things were quite shaky. My prayer life went into overdrive at that time. Anyway, what is so interesting is that this Muslim man, he could see the injustice in what was happening, and he was willing to put his passport in for mine. And he was the one that checked on my family to make sure everything was okay. And when a friend asked him, why would he be willing to do that for somebody like me, because we were strangers, he said, no. They have invited me to their house. They have shown me hospitality. And therefore, I know these people well. They are no longer strangers to me. And it was a wonderful thing. And I believe with every part of my being, that this whole thing about reconciliation and building bridges was nothing to do with me. It was an example of what I mentioned last time, that in these places where we may be unfamiliar or not have sufficient wisdom or knowledge, Jesus always goes ahead because it is his job ultimately to reconcile. There is another aspect to this story that I want to share. Those same people who didn't stand with me, they'd also mocked my faith. Quite often, being on a construction site, I would be the only Christian there, and there would be nothing I could not handle or have not come across before. But for those that are Christians, you might be familiar with these comments that that are sort of unhelpful because they're not always a good springboard to start a further conversation. Anyway, somebody came up. We had a party. I was eventually released, but I knew I would have to leave the country. And we were having this very natural conversation at a party, and some beers were flowing, and it was all very sociable. And a dear friend came to me, actually a friend of my wife, said, Phil, how can you be so calm? Because you believe in God, and she was actually interested in faith herself. How can you still believe when there is so much injustice? And I said, well, I believe God was with me when I was in the police station, and I believe God is with me now. And it was really interesting because of all these mocking voices that I've encountered up to this point. There must have been a good 20 people listening to the conversation about how I had faith in Jesus. But because of the trial and because of the engagement I had with people outside of our group, there was no mocking, but there was listening and trying to understand what I was saying. So this story is a big part of my story of faith, and this is very much an abridged version. And someday it will become part of maybe a book, who knows. But reflecting on this week, I have put pen to paper and have written a poem about can we be friends with people who are not like ourselves. And the poem is called Can We Be Friends? And I hope you enjoy it. Can we be friends when prayer calls otherwise? I hear the song from white towers and pause. Do you also sense within yourself thanks rising? You come to our home and break bread with us, and my doubts dull as we speak of heaven. You ask of Christ, prayer, and what is just? We agree that holy words can be empty. Sacred lives build bridges between worlds during the cause of conflict towards peace. Such resolve imbues Logos' defiance. So at my arrest, he calls out the unjust. Mockers of faith are brought to wary silence. Yes, befriend those in God's image are made. Grace hides where hypocrites are frightened to wade. I thank you for joining me again. I won't be around next week. I'm in the UK going to a wedding and we'll be busy celebrating with family. But I will see you the week after. Please like this video, Instagram clip, wherever you're watching it. Um, and I would much appreciate if you would do that. And I'd be just blown away if you could make a comment or raise a question. Anyway, look after yourselves and see you in 2 weeks.